You're listening to a 95BFM podcast.
In breaking news early this morning, President Joe Biden stepped down as the Democratic candidate in the US election race. It comes following mounting concern around Biden's age and competence to serve another term as president, as well as a campaign from the party itself for the president to step back. Now, only 3.5 months out from Election Day, the Democrats must pick a new candidate, likely to be Vice President Kamala Harris. I spoke to geopolitical analyst from the University of Otago, Jeffrey Miller, about what happens next and what effect this will have on the Democrats' chances of staying in office. We also talk about what impact the result of the election will have here in Aotearoa, as well as the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Palestine. What happens now? What are the implications of Biden stepping down from the race?
Well, they need a new candidate, in short, and Kamala Harris, Joe Biden's vice president, is very much the front runner in all of this. The Democratic establishment seems to be throwing its weight behind Harris. Hillary Clinton has come out and endorsed Kamala Harris and Joe Biden himself, and that will carry huge weight because 3,900 or thereabouts of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention are already pledged to Joe Biden. I think it would be stunning if Harris doesn't get the nomination. But there is a process to be worked through. It's not an absolute guarantee, and there will be no doubt others who would like the job. So there will be a nomination process. Essentially, it's reopened now, but there isn't much time. The Democratic National Convention starts on the 19th of August, so in a month's time in Chicago, and that's where everything must be decided. That's the very latest, but in reality, I think it will be decided very, very quickly that Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party.
And what's the official process that they have to go through to pick this candidate? So it's pretty likely that it's going to be Kamala Harris, but how do they officially go about that?
Well, look, officially there's Democratic Party, and then they choose the nominee, and there's a system of delegates, so for each state, and the party structure. And it's fairly arcane. There are a lot of rules involved. There was some talk before this all happened that it would be conducted as a virtual vote before the Democratic National Convention, and that comes down to some arcane rules on the state of Ohio. So they were looking at getting it all wrapped up by early August, and then the Democratic National Convention would just be a coronation, effectively, of the nominee, who until this morning was Joe Biden, and there was some talk about Joe Biden wanting to get this done quickly to avoid taking it for another month. I think it still could happen that Kamala Harris is anointed virtually. Remember, they've got all of 3.5 months until the election on November the 5th. I think the Democrats will be very keen to get their candidate, whoever it is, sealed pretty quickly. I don't think they want another month of uncertainty. In theory, it could go to what's called an open convention, where all the delegates sort of choose who they think's best on the day in Chicago. I think it's just really unlikely in practice. In theory, it's possible that some wildcard candidate comes out. And look, there are other names who are talked about. Gavin Newsom is perhaps the most prominent one, the governor of California. But in reality, I just can't see that happening. Kamala Harris has got a huge war chest of money. All the funds that have been raised for Joe Biden's campaign can now effectively be used by her, and there are already processes underway to facilitate that. She's got a huge advantage, and I think really we'll just see a rubber stamping of her candidacy in all likelihood.
There's been a lot of pressure on Biden to step down throughout this campaign, but he has been pretty staunch in saying that that's not something that he was considering or going to do. So this move has kind of come out of the blue in terms of what he's been saying. Why do you think that it's been such a sudden change?
Look, it's a surprise and yet not a surprise, isn't it? Because the last 3 weeks has been all this chatter. It all started after that debate performance on June the 27th, and it was just a woeful performance by Joe Biden, and it's never really stopped since then, the chatter. Joe Biden, in a sense, made it worse. He gave interviews afterwards. He gave a press conference after the NATO summit in which he referred to Volodymyr Zelensky as the president of Russia. There were all kinds of gaffes that he made in some of these interviews. And then a whole lot of Democrats, around 30 congressional Democrats, including 4 senators, came out and said that he should, openly came out and said that he should throw in the towel and he should stand aside. George Clooney, celebrities were coming out and saying this as well, and there were all kinds of editorials being written. There was immense pressure for Joe Biden, and while officially perhaps he was been telling us for the last week that he was in it to win it and he was running, perhaps the process was just being ironed out, under which he would actually stand aside, and that's what's transpired this morning.
Do you think now that this will increase the Democrats' chance of a win, or do you think the concern around Biden's age already has caused a lot of questions for a lot of voters?
Yes, the Democrats are battered and bloodied now. I mean, they're a mess. They don't have a candidate. We're three and a half months out from the election. This should have all happened last year. If Joe Biden was going to stand aside and not have a second term, it could have happened in an orderly fashion. If he had stood aside and if Democrats had been bold enough and brave enough to stand up to Joe Biden a year ago, rather than coming out at the last minute and saying, "Oh no, he's not good enough." So it's been a fiasco, a debacle for them. Look, I don't know whether Kamala Harris will be any better than Joe Biden. I think she will be fine. To be perfectly honest, from my personal opinion, I think she'll be better than probably a lot of commentators give her credit for. At the same time, she's got mountains to climb. This is going to be a huge uphill battle against Donald Trump, who's got huge momentum behind him now after the Republican National Convention last week with a confirmed vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance. The Democrats are a mess. They're all at 6s and 7s. They're behind the 8 ball, and they're going to have their work cut out for them, whoever the nominee is, whether it's Kamala Harris or someone else.
Now, to throw things into a broader sense of the election, there's been a lot of talk about this election in Aotearoa, but I'm sure there's a lot of Kiwis actually thinking, why does this affect us? So how will the result of this election have implications on Aotearoa?
Well, look, the US is the world's only superpower, and whether we like it or not, what happens in the US affects us as well. I mean, you can argue and say that sometimes there's too much talk about US politics, and I would tend to agree some of the internal machinations. Do we really need to know about the rules of the Democratic National Committee? What we care about in the end is the impact and what the US president will do in New Zealand's region in terms of foreign policy. I think some of these questions should be what we're focusing on now. What will a new president mean for the Indo-Pacific? What will a new president mean for Ukraine, for the Middle East? I think these are huge questions that we need to be thinking about. Should New Zealand still consider joining AUKUS if there's going to be a change at the top in the White House? It's all very well talking about New Zealand joining AUKUS, this big defence pact with the Australian and the United Kingdom and the US, with Joe Biden as president. Does New Zealand want to still consider that if Donald Trump potentially is president? There's just massive questions right now. There's going to be a huge shift. Whoever is president, there's going to be a huge shift in foreign policy terms come 2025, because it's clear that the war in Ukraine is going to be wound up one form in one way or another. It's just not going to continue. The funding from Western allies at the same pace as talk of some kind of negotiated settlement. So how's that going to happen? What's going to happen in the Middle East? The situation in Gaza is only getting worse, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We've seen drone strikes on Tel Aviv over the weekend by Houthi rebels from Yemen. You look at the Pacific, what's going to happen there? There's just huge questions. Donald Trump has got his own views, and they're very, very clear. And we just simply don't know what Kamala Harris's foreign policy views are going to be like, or whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being if it turns out not to be her.
Yeah, so you talk about Ukraine and Palestine-Israel conflict as well, and you say we don't know a lot about Kamala Harris's foreign policy. Do you think a Democratic Party with Kamala Harris as a leader will have a different approach to what they have over the presidential term in terms of Ukraine and Palestine, or is it kind of too early to say?
Well, look, she's been in lockstep with Joe Biden over the course of Joe Biden's term. That's absolutely normal for a vice president. The vice president simply backs up what the president says. So when Joe Biden's been out there supporting Ukraine, so has Kamala Harris. She's also been supporting Ukraine. But I think whoever is in the White House next year, they're just going to have to face realities on some of these things. When it comes to Ukraine, the West has put in huge amounts of aid to Ukraine over the past, well, it will be almost 3 years by the time the next president enters office. and in the end it hasn't really shifted the dial. So I don't think there's just going to be the appetite to continue pouring in that money into Ukraine. Donald Trump has made that very clear what his position is, and J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate especially. If it's a Donald Trump presidency, it's going to be America first. If it's Kamala Harris, it's a question mark at this point. We just simply don't know. I imagine, regardless of who is president, there will be some perhaps commonalities. I think we're going to see a drawdown in Ukraine of funding. I think we're going to see continuation of quite a hawkish policy towards China. It's going to be, though, of a different tone if Donald Trump comes back in. But Donald Trump started very much the anti-China campaign in the US back in 2015, so he's not going to resile from that position. But Joe Biden notably has continued that. Joe Biden has continued with quite a hawkish policy towards China, and that's what all the discussions about New Zealand joining AUKUS in the end are all about. It's all about countering China.
That was geopolitical analyst from the University of Otago, Jeffrey Miller, on President Joe Biden stepping down from the election race.
That was a 95BFM podcast. To hear more, head to 95bfm.com/bcasts.